Well, I've been pretty much spending my weekends working on my Z, but my parents' 300Z here just decided to completely write off the water pump bearing. It was making a little bit of a squeak, and it just catastrophically failed, blew the front seal out, blasted all the antifreeze out of it. Complete and total failure. And I don't think I've actually had this one on the channel before, because up to this point it's actually worked pretty good. But I wanted to go over this car just for a second and just kind of point out why I think it's interesting. So this car is an 87. I don't know if it's been painted before or not. The paint's probably 7.5 out of 10. It's not terrible. It's filthy because this thing gets driven regularly, but it's got the cool 87 rims. It does say it's a turbo, but they're just badges. And I cannot be charged with that sin. It was like that when my parents bought it. What is really cool about this car, though, is the interior is super nice in this thing. So this has, I think, whatever they call the deluxe interior. So it's got the automatic digital climate control in it. And it's got the digital gauges, which are awesome. So what's really cool about this tack, which I've never seen in any other car, is that's like basically the torque curve or horsepower curve of this motor. And the height of these lines changes with how hard on the throttle you are. So if you're just cruising around, these lines come across, but they're not very tall. And if you stand on it, then they jump all the way up to the top like they are now, which is super cool. That noise that's running is a vacuum pump because this thing's got vacuum leaks that screw up the HVAC. But yeah, the digital gauges are cool. It's got this auto check thing, which is saying that the washer fluid's low. It's got an oil temp gauge, cruise control. Pretty much everything works on this car. It just has a bunch of random little electrical gremlins. Like if you accidentally bump the AM/FM button, then the radio just shuts off and won't turn back on for a few days. It's just got weird stuff like that. The automatic transmission kind of jerks around for no apparent reason sometimes whenever it's cold. And this thing has a pretty bad running problem where it surges and just bucks around, won't run right. You pretty much have to just floor the thing, let it rev out, and then it's fine. Pretty confident it's the mass airflow sensor. So we might end up looking into that as well because there's a new one floating around. There is the Nissan 3000. But yeah, the old bearing here, not having a good time. So I'm just gonna start taking the shroud off, getting stuff out of the way, and hopefully it's not too bad to get to that. Well, if the state of my wrist is any indication, there's a gross lack of space in the front of these stupid things. So there's one bolt up here, there might be two down at the bottom, I don't know. This one just had metal clips on it. I pulled up onto it and on it until it was loose, but I think it's supposed to have bolts. But that doesn't let you get the shroud out. The shroud's got to come out with the fan. So you have this room to get those bolts out. You can't get a socket on it. I'm not even sure you could get a closed end wrench on it. You're just using an open end wrench. And I'm using a screwdriver bound up in another one to keep the pulley from turning. It's a mess. I'll be working on this for probably the next 15 minutes. All right, the fan and shroud assembly is out. Just some little 10mm bolts. I held that in. You have to take both of them out together. There's no room to get them out separate. If you have something longer like this, then you're gonna be way better off because there's just not enough room between this AC idler pulley and the fan to really get your hand in here with a wrench. So I zip tied a 10mm wrench to this, and that made life way easier because I could keep my hands out from between the fan and the motor. As far as getting the belts off, loosen that bolt there, tap this pulley down, that gets that belt off. The water pump belt threw itself off in the catastrophe of the bearing failure, so that was good. The power steering pump has a fairly ridiculous tensioner. You have to loosen that bolt there, loosen this bolt up here, which you can get a socket through the front of the pulley, thankfully. And there is a rod connecting to the back of that pivot there that has, can't even see it, but there's a nut on a rod under the power steering pump. If you can get a ratcheting 12mm wrench on there and back that nut way off. I mean, it's right under directly under the power steering pump. And then you can tap around on the power steering pump on the pulley here with a piece of wood or something and get that loose so you can take the belt off. Now the water pump bolts are behind the timing cover, so all these pulleys got to come off, and then the timing cover has to come off. And with all of that off, I can finally get to the water pump. So you have to pull the balancer off in order to get the lower timing cover off. It has a bunch of bolts that go all the way around it. And then you have to take this tube off here, this guy. You gotta take him loose. There's one bolt in that bracket right there that bolts it to the engine block. You take that guy out, and then a tool that is worth investing in. These are not that expensive, but if you get a set of these, it'll definitely pay for itself eventually. So what you use these for is when you have a hose on something like this. I pulled around on it and couldn't get it loose, even though the hose clamp was completely loose. So what you do is you take one of these, and there's all kinds of different sizes and shapes of them, and you poke it in between the rubber hose and the metal, and then you just push it around like that, and it breaks the hose off of the metal so that it just slips right off. Really, really clever tool, and definitely saves you from either having to cut the hose or bashing your knuckles into something. So with that off, I can then take off this upper timing cover, and with all of that junk out of the way, finally we have access to the water pump with the really awesome bearing. So I'm gonna go ahead and zip that guy off since we have full access to it now. It's probably also worth noting, if this motor had any other maintenance that it need done preventative wise, like if it needed a timing belt or that hose up under there or the thermostat or any of that stuff, I would probably go ahead and take care of that now. But this motor has already had all of that done within the last few years. And this motor as a whole only has, I don't even think it has 100,000 miles on it. So time is really the main problem with all the parts on this thing, and everything's pretty well taken care of that we would want to address here, thankfully. The only thing is I will be addressing something with that mass airflow sensor while it's easy to get to, but everything else in here is already dealt with and shouldn't cause any problems. And not uncommon for me to be losing bolts, so we're going to try a new tactic here. So I bought one of these little storage bins, and I've been dropping the bolts in it with a note as to what they go to. So if I haven't lost any bolts by the time this project is done, then we'll call that a win, because if I'm stuck waiting on parts, I can just close this whole thing up, lock it closed, throw it on the shelf, and I don't have to worry about remembering where anything went or losing anything, theoretically. So we'll see how that goes. Well, somehow I didn't even tear that gasket taking it apart, which is unfortunate because I'm going to replace it anyways. But it looks like the block is all right. It doesn't look like the impeller on the water pump really got into the block itself. Everything there looks decent. This guy, though, is crunchy. Both bearings. I thought it was just the outer one, but man, we just wrote the whole thing off. Well, I just did some checking in the old maintenance log, and it turns out that this water pump is an aftermarket one, because I looked up that number, and it's not Nissan. It's a company called US Motor Works, and nowhere do they say they're based out of California, but nowhere on their website or any listing for this part could I find where it was made, so most definitely it's some kind of Chinese bottom-of-the-barrel garbage. And God, this part is just such junk. So this thing catastrophically failed. I mean, you can see how off-centered the shaft is, and the play makes it even more off-centered, and it's just terrible. This part has 19,900 miles on it. Didn't even get 20,000 miles out of it before it totally failed. The aftermarket parts are just not getting any better. I mean, that is just terrible. This one came with not this Z, but a different one. And no idea who made it. But it's either I need to throw it away now and never use it, or just put it on and see what it's going to be. And I think what I'm going to do is just put it on. It'll be whatever it's going to be. At least we'll know. Because I feel bad about throwing it away and not using it. So we'll see. We'll see if it can beat the 19,000 miles that one did. Well, I got the new gasket on, and I'm going to continue a little bit of a test, I guess, that I've been doing. Don't have any results back yet. But this ultra blue Permatex gasket maker doesn't seem near as likely to tear gaskets. I've gotten away with reusing, in one case, a timing cover gasket. Probably two, I think I got away with it twice, taking the cover off. I took the cover off twice and didn't tear the gasket using this stuff. And so what I've been doing, and we'll see how it works out, is I used the ultra black on the back side of the gasket so that hopefully the gasket stays really stuck to the water pump. And then I'm using this ultra blue, which doesn't seem to be as, doesn't seem to have as much adhesive strength to it, I guess. And the theory is that hopefully the gasket, if we were to pull the water pump off, will stay stuck to the water pump instead of half stuck to the engine block and ripping. Mostly, it'll just make cleaning up the gasket surface easier, because cleaning up the pump is a lot easier because you can actually take it off. And on both surfaces, both on the water pump and the engine block, I degreased the metal surfaces before I'm applying the gasket maker, just to give it the best chance of actually sealing up. On some engines, you actually have to put a little bit of sealant on the threads of the bolts because they go into a water passage. I poked something down into each hole, and it does not appear that any of these holes actually go into the coolant passage, so I don't think I need to put any sealant on the threads. All right, this thing is starting to go back together. Just a few things of note. I went ahead and I took a brush and some dish soap, and dish soap and water, and I went and really cleaned all of the belts and all of the pulleys. That's going to help this thing not just, squawk and scream for the first however many miles this thing runs. Because with all that antifreeze on there, it's just going to make it way more likely for those belts to just squeak and make all kinds of racket. So hopefully they'll be quiet having done that. The alternator, before you go putting this tube on, there's an upper mount on the alternator. Hard to see it way down there. It's behind that one on the power steering pump, or lower than that one on the power steering pump, I should say. Loosen that guy, because that tube completely obstructs it, and if that bolt is very tight, you're not going to be able to loosen it without taking that tube off. So you loosen that bolt, and then there is a lower bolt in that sliding part of the alternator bracket. Loosen that guy, loosen the tensioner, which that tensioner is nice because you can actually see it from under the car, unlike the power steering one, which you can't see at all. And then, you can get a piece of wood or something soft and tap around on the alternator and get it pushed forward where you have enough slack that you can set the water pump pulley on there. From there, got this tube installed. Get the bolt in that mounts this tube. There's just one bolt up in here. Get that guy in first, then tighten up your hose clamps, because if you need to swivel this around, then you're not going to be able to unless the hose clamps are loose. And I think the power steering pump belt, I think I might be better off putting that on later, so I'm holding off on that. The next big pain is going to be getting the fan and the shroud on here. I think that, unfortunately, is the next step, and that's going to make working on everything in here pretty difficult. But I think we're to the point of putting that on. Oh, another thing that kind of threw me for a loop that I forgot about. So another reason this strategy has kind of worked out nice is I just started at the bottom when I was taking things apart. So I just started at the top when I started putting things back together. And I thought I was missing a water pump bolt because I was one short for the bolts that I had in the box. And what I didn't realize when I took the whole thing apart is there is a water pump bolt that's retained in the timing cover. So that bolt doubles as holding the timing cover in and the water pump. So that was where my missing bolt was. But anyways, other than that, I mean, this has been going together relatively easy. It's just a little time consuming. All right, last thing for real. The balancer, I had to use that puller to get it off. And it hasn't been that long since that balancer was off. So it clearly had a little bit of corrosion in it. And I don't think it should take a puller to pull it off. I think it's just supposed to be the keyway and the bolt that retains it. Anyways, I put a little bit of anti-seize on the inside bore of that balancer pulley assembly so that hopefully the next time, heaven help me, that I have to take this apart, I don't have to use the puller. And as far as torquing that bolt, I don't know what the torque spec is supposed to be, but there really wasn't a convenient way I could come up with to hold the motor in place where I could tighten that bolt. So I got it as tight as I could by hand with using my left hand in a belt to hold the pulley. And then I just hit it with the impact that I used to take the bolt off. And we'll see how that goes. I'm pretty confident these are supposed to be studs and not bolts. But look at the insanity that I'm having to do to get these things in. The fan is loose so that I can sneak the bolts in on the end of a ratcheting 10mm. And then I'm using this flat blade to both hold the fan up and also keep the bolt pushed in as I ratchet the wrench there to tighten the bolt in. Kind of wild. All right, got the belts tensioned up. Left them just on the little on the loose side because I'd rather have to go back and tighten them up than have them too tight. I think everything's good now. So the bottom of the shroud has these metal clips that just slide over the shroud and the other piece of plastic down there, and it just pinches them together. So you just push those guys back on, and then it's the one bolt here. And these kits are pretty cool. Here's this guy. So you just fill the funnel up with water. It seals to the whatever the filler neck there, and so whenever the system's full and has all the air burped out of it, you put that on there, take the funnel off, don't spill anything. Well, it won't let you spill anything. You put this back over the bottle, drain it back in, and you're all good. Well, I got everything back together. I went and drove it around a little bit. It didn't overheat, it's not leaking, so I think the water pump fix is good. And then for the first time in years, this thing actually runs pretty good. So I guess this mass airflow sensor actually works right. I think this is the third one that it's had in it, but it runs way better now than it ever has. I mean, it's still slow as all get out, unfortunately, but man, it actually runs pretty good now. So feel good about that. I'm not sure what the future is going to be for this car. It's got some other problems going on. The most worrying is first gear in this thing makes a whine. And that noise quits as soon as it goes to second drive or overdrive. So I don't know what is going on in the transmission, but there's definitely something going out in the trans, which is lame. And then again, whatever electrical gremlins it has completely killed all the power in there. And this is the longest it's been since it's come back. Usually, if it did this, it'd come back maybe in a few hours or a day or the next time you started it, but it doesn't seem to have any indication that it's coming back. So I don't know what the future is for this car. I don't know if it's gonna hang around or not. If we end up having to tear into it and mess with it, maybe that'll be another video. Or maybe this one just gets kicked down the road if it turns into too big of a fiasco. I don't know. It's a cool car. I really like it. I just am not sure I like working on it. But that tack, though, that tack is cool. All right, in about 10 seconds of diagnosing, I figured out that if I take the wiring harness going to the fuse block and I start moving it around, all kinds of stuff starts happening in the car. Like now that's lit up. So I think our problem's in here somewhere, but we'll save that for another day.